Some will already know the location of Dial House in Great Asby. It's on the north side of St. Peter's Church, and now known to some villagers as the Dark House, because it's so rarely occupied and so rarely lit. Its location has, over the years, led to it being called in manor or parish documents Church Farm or Back of Church. Its present name, Dial House, almost certainly derives from a sundial which once stood in the front garden. That adornment is described in some detail in the notes of the surveyor who looked at the house as part of the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments Survey of Westmoreland in 1934. Those notes about the sundial, now on microfiche in the County Record Office in Kendal, didn't make it into the final published volume, and, despite the detailed description of the sundial, a typo resulted in the house being rendered Deal House, D-E-A-L, in that final published work. I found the sundial in Merton. It's now back, sadly, in 3 parts, at Dial House. I'm hoping to repair it and restore it to its original garden location, but that's another story. Some of you will also be aware that Dial House and its neighbour, Hunting House, with the slightly lower ridgeline to the right here, were once a single farmstead. Dial House was the domestic end, and what is now the separate dwelling Hunting House was the agricultural part, or down house, of a fairly typical linear farmstead, of which there are several in Great Asby, of course. A down house would have had a by below, maybe sometimes a back kitchen as well, at the end and next to the domestic part of the building, and a hayloft above, perhaps sometimes alongside basic upper floor sleeping spaces for male farm servants. The upper story of the down house, with these sleeping areas, frequently did not connect with the upper story of the domestic family end. That was certainly the case here in Dial House. Male farm servants were kept well away from the daughters of the house. And all linear farmsteads made careful use of the downslope to ensure that effluent from the byre in the down house flowed in the right direction. Some may recognise this dated lintel at the front door of what is now Hunting House, but it would, once upon a time, have been the lintel of an entrance to the whole linear farmstead. We'll come back to this date stone. We could speculate, perhaps not too fancifully, that Dial House may be located on a site of one of the first 8 households established in what is believed to have been a planned manor in the 12th century. A charter of that time, this is how it appears in translation, in an 1885 publication from the Royal Commission on Historical Manuscripts, tells us that the large medieval hospital of St. Peter at York, that's hospital in the sense of a place of refuge and safety rather than treatment, more like a care home, I guess, that hospital of St. Peter held the manor of Asby Winderwath, and it had 8 tenants on its land here. They're 8 men, underlined in line 5. As you've heard me say many times before, these farmsteads would have been on the north side of the beck, and the lands linked to those farmsteads would have been in strips, scattered across the communally farmed common fields or town fields in an arc to the west, east and north. Obviously, over the centuries, original farmsteads have been rebuilt many, many times, progressing from wooden or wattle and daub structures thatched with turf sods or heather to stone buildings roofed with sandstone flags and, later, with slates. All would have been held as tenancies of the lord of the manor. From another charter, here translated and transcribed, and this is his handwriting, by John Hill, Lord of the Manor of Asby Winderwath in the mid-19th century. And from this we know the names of the 8 men who were tenants in the early 13th century, and those names are underlined here. Peter de Carthorne. Now, could that be Peter de Garthorne or Peter de Gaythorne? Remember, this hospital of St. Peter also held land at what is now Gaythorne Hall. And there are lots and lots of Godwins. Could one of these men have been an early tenant of the site now occupied by Dial House? From the 16th century onwards, a number of new factors impacted on the nature of building. First, certain legal decisions, which meant that customary tenancies, as they were called, could be bequeathed to an heir, making them tantamount to a freehold. Second, increasing agricultural prosperity. For example, evidence from the Kendal area suggests that from the late 17th to the mid-18th century, the income of farmers rose by up to nearly 70%. There were also the small matters of the ending of the English civil wars and of the end of outbreaks of plague and famine in the area. The last famine probably as late as 1623. The result of all this was a significant rebuilding in stone, a more permanent material, of course. It was worth investing in the property if you could pass it on to your heir. You may have already come across the term used to label this period in history, from the later 17th to the mid-18th century. It's the Great Rebuilding. Look at the dated lintels around Great Asby, all of them probably related to phases of rebuilding of the structures that they're on. The earliest, which you've already seen at Dial House. On a grander scale, Asby Hall, with a date of 1694, although the economic and legal levers at work on this building would not have been the same as they were for the linear farmsteads. And then more linear farmsteads like Dial House, Andrew and Sue Savage's place with a date stone of 1691, although almost certainly not in its original position. Elm Tree, the older part that is, with a date of 1694, like Asby Hall. A now concealed date stone, believed to be of 1707, at the rear of the 3 greyhounds, which was, of course, a linear farmstead as well as an inn. And Michael Shipley's White House with a date of 1748. They are all within this peak period of rebuilding. Dial House, as you have noticed on this last slide, offers us 2 dated lintels, although one, of course, is on what is now Hunting House. This older one, which we've already looked at, carved, raised, off-centre lettering, gives us a full inscription of ES 1680. We'll come back later to the probable identity of ES. The second Dial House date stone, shown here, is from 1729. This one is positioned above the front door of the dwelling still known as Dial House. We'll also come back to this date stone, to some of the detail of the rebuilding probably associated with it, and to the likely identity behind these 3 initial letters between the numbers, I, E, A. This is the first of 3 plans, which, in part at least, are expressions of my speculations about the development of Dial House. They were drawn a number of years ago by Rosa Terrapax when she was a master's student in historic building conservation in the School of Architecture at Oxford Brookes. She's now Historic England's Inspector of Buildings for the East of England. On this first plan, I'm going back to a time before that 1680 date stone we looked at, and I'm drawing on the insights of students of Cumbrian vernacular architecture such as Susan Denyer and the late Ronald Brunskill, to speculate that at an earlier point in its life, Dial House was a single-storey, 2.5-bay building thatched with turf or heather, with a door in its eastern gable. At the right, as we look at it, there's a big red arrow pointing to where I'm speculating that door may have been, although it should be acknowledged that this speculation about earlier doors in eastern gables is not universally accepted. With this next speculative plan, we have reached the year of that first date stone, 1680, as well as going a bit beyond it. Here I'm suggesting the addition of a down house, remember that word from slide 1, comprising in the main a building of agricultural purpose, byre below, hayloft above, etc., etc. And you can still see the old wooden lintel of a forking hole through which hay would have been thrown up into that loft in the eastern gable of what is now Hunting House. The lower red arrow marks the position of that 1680 date stone, which would have been positioned above the main entrance to what was called a cross passage or hallan. After the building of the down house, this cross passage and its door would have replaced the door in the eastern gable of the domestic dwelling and become the main entrance to a linear layout. Here you can see that passage going through the building in the direction of a large upper red arrow. Cattle and people as well, of course, would have entered the building at the rear where that upper arrow is positioned. People would have turned to the right, cattle to the left, going to the byre, marked here with a green arrow at the right of the plan. People would have continued along a passage called a mell, with a wooden partition called a heck, separating the passage from a large open fireplace with its lath and plaster hood carrying away the smoke. And they'd have gone on into the room known variously as the firehouse, front end, uphouse, or house place. We've gone back, very briefly, to my speculated pre-1680 plan. In taking this route, then, I'm suggesting that people, in using the mell, would be passing through what would have been the wall opening of the original gable entry, or, to be precise, my speculated wall opening. Beyond the firehouse, at the left of the plan, and marked with a blue arrow, is the parlour. The regional historian, Susan Denyer, who I've already mentioned, tells us, and I quote, "The name parlour today conjures up the idea of a small sitting room, and that is just what this room became in many houses during the 19th century, when a second flue and fireplace were added to it. We don't know when the flue and fire were fitted in the Dial House parlour, but," Susan continues, "in the 17th and 18th centuries, the parlour was unheated and used as the best bedroom, chamber or bower, where the master and mistress of the house slept. A bed, bedding, a chest for clothes, and sometimes a chair were basic accoutrements of this room, their elaboration depending on the wealth of their owners." Now, I've added another bit of speculation on this plan. It's marked by a smaller red arrow just left of top centre, to the left of the mell. I'm suggesting that access to the upper floor in the domestic end, and this upper level may have been no more than a sleeping loft or a storage loft, access which may only have been a rough ladder, was improved by the construction of an outshot containing a stone spiral staircase. If such a structure did exist at Dial House, it was replaced by a larger, probably late 18th or very early 19th century structure that we'll look at later, and which now contains an unusually wide timber dogleg staircase with a half landing. But an outshot containing a spiral staircase of the kind I have in mind does survive in the village, very close to Dial House, at the rear of elm tree. It's semicircular in the interior, but squared off externally. Here is that rear outshot of elm tree squared off, as you can see, with a blocked window indicated by the red arrow, which would once have illuminated the stairway. Here, in the ground floor of the older listed part of elm tree, we're looking at the first 5 steps of the stone spiral stair within the outshot. Here, the arrow is pointing at one of the curved depressions in the step, each of them well worn by the feet of many generations of occupants. Probably shod in clogs made of alder wood, with iron protectors fitted to their soles. Here, we're looking down the same stairs from the upper floor. The characteristics of the door openings of the upper and ground floors at Elm Tree, giving access to this stone staircase, are similar to those of the surviving door openings that still give access to the now more modern stairway in the large rear extension in Dial House. I turn again to Susan Denyer, who refers to a particular sequence in the development of staircases. This is what she's written. A dog-leg staircase of oak treads with turned or split balusters, usually sited in a projecting wing at the back of the house, and quite often, apparently, superseding a stone spiral staircase. As I've suggested, it's possible that there was a similar sequence at Dial House, with all traces of a smaller outshot, housing a stone staircase, being removed by the later construction of a gabled rear wing, housing perhaps a predecessor of that dogleg staircase we see there today. We'll visit this gabled rear wing at Dial House a little later. On now to 1729 in the century following it, and to something that is much less speculative and associated with the date stone of that year 1729. Here we're focusing on the domestic end of the linear structure, in particular where I have placed the large red arrow. This points to the position of a new fashionably central front door, which may have been accompanied by new windows and modified window openings, with a possible exception of the fire window marked by a pale blue arrow, which was blocked. The original windows that were replaced were probably small with oak mullions. Desire for a fashionable symmetry may not have been the only reason for blocking the fire door, that blue arrow, as part of the 1729 refurbishment. In a few moments, we'll see that the fire area was probably also significantly changed at this same time, and the fire window would have been no longer needed to give light and air to a large inglenook fireplace with a fire hood above it. This blocked fire window is almost certainly the small blocked window referred to in the Dial House notes of the same 1930s surveyor who spotted the sundial in the front garden. Despite the horror of the windows inserted in the later 20th century, here you can see that more symmetrical appearance of the house, although you can also see that it's not a perfect symmetry, that it was achieved by the changes of 1729. There was, at this period, in the words of Paul Lewis, an aesthetic aspiration to make things symmetrical. By the way, there's the now reopened fire window, reopened in a late 20th century renovation at the right of the ground floor. Across Cumbria, successive phases of rebuilding at the domestic end of linear farmsteads and the agricultural end, or downhouse, meant that you sometimes ended up with the ridge lines of these two parts of the structure at different heights. As we noted at the time of the first slide, this is the case here at Dial House. See there at the top right. But sometimes the end result is the other way round. The agricultural end is higher than the domestic end. You can see an example of this in Great Asby at Town End. We're looking at it from the west, and the bank barn at the eastern end, the far end, with its hayloft above and byre below, has a higher ridgeline than the house. The beginning of this phase of building of Dial House, approximately 1820 through to 1980 really, when it ceased to be a farmstead, is marked not by a date stone, but by a large rear extension, arrowed here. The ground floor of that is clearly labelled as containing a dairy in this plan of roses. We know from personal recollections of previous occupants of Dial House, the Brunskulls and the Allansons, that this was a dairy in the 20th century, but it may have been such from an earlier time. We don't know if it was a dairy from the word go, because there's some evidence of changes having been made to this structure, changes that might have been made quite early on in its life. Andy Lowe, who used to be Historic Buildings Conservation Officer for the Lake District National Park, spent a day looking at the house about 10 years ago. It was his view that this extension dated from the very late 18th or very early 19th century. The time around Andy's estimated date, which we'll discover when we look in a bit more detail at occupants of the house, could have seen a potentially significant change of tenancy, which may have led to a restructuring of the building to support a new emphasis on, say, dairy production. This, as you can see, is not the prettiest view of the large rear extension. Let's start in the middle with the sill or lintel question. Is this evidence of an older feature, and was it the sill of an upper floor opening or the lintel of an opening into the lower floor? The two openings at the right appear to be identical, with one exception I'll mention in a few seconds, and the rather odd position of the upper one almost certainly suggests that it is later than the roof. And this is the difference between the two windows on the right. The sill and lintel of the lower window have settings for 7 vertical iron bars, approximately 1¼ inches in diameter. And this may have been part of a quite early modification of the building to provide good ventilation for a dairy whilst restricting access. A third window of the same type as these two we've just been looking at is in the gable of this extension, and it illuminates the staircase. Behind the oil storage tank to the left, you can probably see it as a blocked doorway with a substantial sandstone lintel and jambs. My hunch is that this opening was there when the building was first built and predates the two windows to the right. So my limited speculation is that this gabled extension had, first, an unknown agricultural purpose, and that the lower floor was then repurposed as a dairy with sleeping space above it and a staircase with an illuminating window added. There is evidence within Dial House that might be associated with some of the different phases of its building. Let's take a look at some of them. I'm not going to take you on a tedious tour of every architectural feature of this kind. Instead, I'm going to take you on what I fear may turn out to be a slightly tedious tour of a few of them. Many of you will be familiar with some of these features from your own homes or from things you've seen on visits to historic buildings of one kind or another. Perhaps one of the commonest items of evidence of reconstruction of farmsteads in this region are reused timbers. There may well have been a scarcity of timber in the Upper Eden Valley from the late 16th century onwards, as is argued by some historians for the North Pennines, which played a part in encouraging reuse. Evidence of reuse is certain, although we can't, of course, be equally certain that the timbers were always being reused within the same building. In this image, we have part of a ceiling beam in the parlour, which shows evidence of previous use. That evidence is in the form of 2 large mortises cut in the timber. This image shows one of those mortises. In the beam's now horizontal position, these mortises appear as more or less 45-degree incisions. From this evidence, it's probably safe to conclude that this timber had a previous life as a crook blade. Let's see why this is. I'm using this rather stylized image because it's fairly easy to follow, but I'll switch between it and another as we go on to pick up on some more detail. A crook blade, sometimes called a crook blade, is a curved timber, one of a pair, which support the roof of a building, and historically used in England and Wales. You can see 3 pairs, they're numbered, of these long curved timbers in this drawing. They are generally naturally curved timber members that lean inwards and support the other roof timbers. They were made in pairs by sawing a curved timber along its full length to make matching blades. The 2 blades are then generally secured by a horizontal beam, also shown here of course, which thus forms an A shape. Just a comment here. I chose this image to clearly show crook blades, but those who know a bit about roof construction will spot there is one important feature missing from it. There are no purlins. Just remember that for a moment, and we'll come back to it. Back for now to the horizontal beam securing the crook blades. A red arrow pointing to it. It's called a collar beam. One Dialhouse's parlour ceiling beam was a crook blade in a vertical position. What now appears as a more or less 45-degree mortise would have been in a horizontal plane, holding this collar beam position, bracing the 2 crook blades, and secured to them by timber pegs. You might have caught a glimpse of the remains of such pegs in this image of the mortise that we looked at a few seconds ago. Here's one of them at the tip of the red arrow. I'm switching now to this drawing showing all the elements of crook terminology. In some ways it's better than the other one I've been using because it includes purlins and gives a better idea of the load distribution. What I want to show here is why the reused crook blade in Dialhouse had more than one mortise cut into it. Here, in the names of timbers contained within the red rectangles, you can see that a crook blade might also have had to accommodate mortises for a collar tie at the top there, as well as the collar beam we've already looked at, and perhaps lower down an arch brace or a strut. Hopefully you can also see why you might find a mortise cut in a different face of a crook timber. That mortise in a different face would have been cut to accommodate a purlin. Can you see that marked by a thick red arrow towards top right? Before we leave our long-serving crook blade, latterly ceiling beam, let's note another surviving feature on its surface. Look at the tip of the blue arrow and, hopefully, you can see a series of small cuts in the surface of the timber, probably made with an adze, creating a cross-hatch pattern. These would have been made so that plaster applied to the surface of the timber had greater purchase. This suggests that this timber would once have been visible within the domestic portion of the house and would have been decorated. And a final word. It's timbers like these, curved crooks, which lie at the source of stories that they are old ship timbers. Although shipbuilders and crook carpenters may have sometimes, and in some places, have been in competition for naturally curved timbers, it's unlikely that in places far from the coast, old ship timbers would have been reused for house construction. The cost of transporting them would have been too great. Going back to our not quite right stylized image for just a moment, you can readily see how at least part of each of the crook blades within a structure would be visible, prompting a likely desire for their decoration. I think there's yet another element of crook structure which can be found within Dial House. I'm showing this image just so that you can see the room position of these nondescript bits of timber. There are two of them, just proud of the surface of the interior wall on the north and south sides of the west gable. As you can see, each one is fairly high up on the wall, close to the ceiling of the downstairs parlour, where we've just looked at the reused crook blade. So they're roughly in the positions marked by these two red arrows pointing towards the wall of the parlour at the left-hand side. Let's go back again to our stylised image to try to get a sense of what these now purposeless timbers might once have been. Marked with more red arrows are two long horizontal timbers called wall plates. The clue to their purpose is in their name. They ran along the top of the outer wall in what would have been a single-storey crook building. Although this drawing, and we're back with what is missing from it, this drawing, incorrectly in my view, shows the wall plates carrying the rafters, whereas they would really be carried by the missing purlins. All the timbers in this drawing are shown as pretty substantial, and they're probably more substantial than a number of the timbers that are in Dial House. But if we go back to our second drawing, we find it depicts timbers of more modest size. So I'm arguing that our mystery parlour timbers are remnants of wall plates of an early crook structure of Dial House. Although there may be those watching this recording who can correct me. If you can, please get in touch with me at khcooper1@aol.com. It's there on the screen, so you can come back and take it down. This tour of structural timbers is probably beginning to get a bit tedious, so just one more example. This would have been a heck post. That means it would have been at one end of a boarded partition, called the heck, a word we've already met in the house plans, which sheltered the snug fireplace area from drafts. That partition, as you can see, is no longer there, although the late Elsie Birbeck remembered it being in place when she was living in Dial House as a child in the 1930s. Here I've marked the heck post's position on one of the floor plans of the house. Remember, those entering the cross passage or hallan from the rear of the building would have turned right into the mell and then passed by the heck to enter the room containing the fire. However, just like the parlour ceiling beam we've looked at, this post also has evidence of at least one previous life, probably more. And also, like that earlier beam, it has evidence of a mortise that probably once held a collar beam or similar bracing timber, retained again by wooden pegs. Hopefully, this image is clear enough for you to see, marked by a red arrow, the position of the mortise and the peg holes. While we're in this part of the building, let's shift our gaze a little to one side of the heck post. You can still see it here at the left of the picture. This is another area of Dial House, which may have undergone significant change around 1729, with the insertion of a fairly typical fireplace of the early 18th century, although it's clearly had some pretty ghastly treatment since then. It's worth spending a bit of time to get our heads around what this fireplace would have replaced. I'm very grateful to Paul Lewis, chair of the Cumbria Vernacular Buildings Group, for this image, captured when he was working on a house at Crabtree Beck. The fireplace, as you can see, shares some characteristics of design with the Dial House fireplace, but see what else we have here. There are three things to note. First, a small triangular spice cupboard, a little unusually to the left of the fire rather than the right. Dial House has a hollow-sounding patch of wall to the right of its fire, which probably marks the location of a spice cupboard. This was a space to keep salt and other spices dry, and would have been part of an inglenook fireplace with a hood which preceded this stone fireplace. Second, a bread oven, which is a later addition, sharing the new flue of the stone fireplace. Frequently the bread oven would have been to the rear of the fire, but still sharing the flue. This is the arrangement in Michael Shipley's White House in Great Asby, and at Fellview Farm, Tony Wallace's place in Little Asby. Third, and perhaps most interestingly, here at Crabtree Beck, Paul Lewis found a complete surviving fire hood. These were of lath and plaster construction, forming a domed hood to carry the smoke up and away. You can just see the curved shape of the lower part of the hood beginning to form, marked by the blue arrow at top left. Have you got that? In this photograph, also provided by Paul, taken at a slightly higher level, we're looking across towards the left-hand side of the fireplace, towards that blue arrow we saw in the last slide. You can see the continuation of the domed hood as it rises, again marked by a blue arrow. At one time, all open fireplaces would have had hoods of this kind, with their leading edge supported on a massive crossbeam. Unsurprisingly, it's called the fire beam, or Bessemer. I've marked that with a red arrow. You can clearly see the leading edge of the hood resting on this beam. Undoubtedly, there would have been a similar arrangement to all this in Dial House, predating the fireplace we see there today. As an aside, this fire beam at Crabtree Beck has a number of apotropaic marks or witch marks to protect the house against the entry of witches or other evil spirits. The chimney was one of the places where such fiends were believed to enter. Back to Paul's first photograph here at Crabtree. We can see how that fire beam we picked out in the last slide spanned the full width of the old open fireplace, marked at the top of the image. Bill Rawlinson, in his Life and Tradition in the Lake District, gives us more detail about how the fire area was arranged for cooking. Bill writes, "The huge canopy or hood extended out into the room about 6 feet above the floor. Across the chimney hood, from the gable wall to the outer edge of the hood, to the fire beam, 2 smaller beams projected, and on these was placed a long beam known as the rannelbock or randle tree, a support for chains, from which cooking utensils were suspended over the fire." Another photograph from the Paul Lewis archive, this time featuring a house at Knype, and showing the type of flue up to which a domed hood of the kind we've just looked at, but lost in this example of course, would have reached. As I mentioned earlier, I could go on to show you altered elements of other parts of Dial House, such as tie beams of roof trusses that have been cut through and replaced with new tie beams placed at a higher level when the ceiling of the upper floor was heightened. This was another very common development in a farmhouse, sometimes happening when the upper floor began to be used primarily for sleeping rather than for storage. But I think we've probably got enough to be going on with. So, a switch of focus now, to take a look at what evidence there might be for the age of some of the timbers we've been looking at in Dial House, or to be more precise, what evidence might there be for the date when the trees from which these timbers were cut were first felled. Some of you may have already come across the word dendrochronology. If not, this Historic England publication, available online, can give you a quick briefing on the whole process. And as you can read here, it's a process that is relatively new. This is a rabbit hole we're not going to go down, but as you can see, up until quite recently, the database of dated timber samples with which you need to compare the samples of timber taken from a house was not complete. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, is the scientific method of dating tree rings, also called growth rings, to the exact year they were formed in a tree. However, for a precise date of the felling of the tree, a full sample to the edge of that tree is needed, which most trim timber will not, for obvious reasons, provide. So, in many cases, what the method does give you is a range of years for the likely date of felling. We do have one precise date for felling Dial House timbers, or some Dial House timbers, but the others are in a range. With a special drill, you take a core from the timber. I used a laboratory based at Nottingham University to take the samples from Dial House. If you're interested in doing this in your own house for dating a sample of, say, 8 to 10 cores, you'd now pay around £1,000. So although this is quite a quick way of obtaining some evidence to assist with dating phases of buildings, it's not particularly cheap. To obtain the age, the sample cores are compared with a dated database of cores. To the best of my knowledge, I believe this database exists primarily for oak, and that was certainly the case in 2014. But I think there may have been some work since then on elm timbers. Some of you watching this may know far more about this than me. In Dial House, 8 oak samples were taken in 2014. 5 were from roof timbers, principal rafters and purlin. 2 from ceiling beams in the parlour. We've already looked at one of those, remember, as probably a reused crock blade. And 1 from what I referred to as being in the position of a heck post. The conclusion of the analysis was that the roof timbers, let's take them first, were all from a group of timbers that were felled in 1728. These were timbers which offered full samples to the edge, which enabled that precise date of felling to be obtained. Given that we have this datestone evidence, which suggests a 1729 phase of rebuilding, it seems likely the roof we see today was added to an earlier and perhaps remodelled structure in that year, using timbers that were felled in 1728. Oak tended to be worked while it was still green, quite soon after felling. A nerdy note here, not more, I hear you cry. Although wooden pegs for fastening and of the kind we've already seen were probably used because they were relatively easy and cheap to make, in green oak the higher water content can cause iron fastenings to rust, weakening the joint. So wooden pegs may actually have been preferred, and seasoned dry wood was used for the pegs. So as the green oak shrank, it tightened around the pegs. The 2 ceiling beams in the parlour likely to be reused crook blades, if you remember, are estimated to have a felling date and felled together, the dendrochronologist suggested. Were they matching blades from a single tree, I wonder? These were estimated to have a felling date between 1543 at the earliest and 1563 at the latest. No full sample to the edge from these chaps. Although, to repeat what I said very early on, there is no real way of knowing if a timber is being reused on the site where it was first used. It remains possible that this timber and the second, similar one in the parlour, represent evidence of a possible rebuilding or partial rebuilding of Dial House in the mid-16th century. As you can read here, the 8th sample, taken from the heck post, had 65 rings spanning the years 1394 to 1458. But there was, as you might expect, not a full sample to the edge of this timber. So an estimated felling date range was calculated to be from 1473 to 1498. Again, do we have evidence here, bearing in mind the caution we need to exercise based on the kind of health warnings I've already pointed out? Do we have evidence of an even earlier crook structure on this site, of which this now at least 630-year-old piece of oak was once part? Whilst it doesn't tell us much about structural phases, I can't leave the subject of timber features without mentioning the panelling which forms most of the partition between the firehouse, home of the heck post, and the parlour, home of the reused truck blades. Village folk memory tells us that this panelling was removed from the old church when it was demolished in the mid-1860s and reused here in Dial House. In a few moments we'll learn a little more about why the reconstruction of the church may have had a close connection with Dial House, but we won't go there just yet. If you look closely at this panelling, you will see that it has been chopped and cut to fit, and doesn't appear to have been uniform in its previous life anyway, but it certainly has the appearance of 17th century panelling of some sort. I was watching a presentation about the Church of Ninekirks near Broome at a meeting of the Appleby and Westmoreland Society, which included this photograph of 17th century box pews fitted at Ninekirks by Lady Anne Clifford. And I thought, thinking of Dial House, of course, they look familiar. So my suggestion is that what we see in the partition at Dial House are parts of 17th century box pews removed from the first church of St. Peter's during its demolition in the mid-1860s. Let's shift our focus once again from the fabric of Dial House to the people who lived in it. From the earliest surviving manor court book of the 17th century, perhaps as much as 500 years after the first structure appeared on the Dial House site, we can trace some possible tenants who held the farmstead of the lord of the manor. Circled top right, we find the name of a Lancelot Scott, who appears to have been succeeded as tenant by a Thomas Gibson. The added words in the red oval added by a manor court official are "Now Thomas Gibson." Thomas was required, I'll read the words here, to lie a brigstone over the park beck. That's a beck that runs under the road at the village end of the moor plantation. And to maintain the causey along the waterside and open a gutter at High Park End in consideration of some ground taken into his park. Park is the name of a field just on the village side of Moor Plantation, and it was part of the Dial House holding. Thomas, or more likely Lancelot before him, appears to have been adding some land to it, to Park. And if you look north up the slope of Park, you can see the remains of a bank running across it, and that was probably the field boundary before, as it says here, Lancelot Scott took some ground into his park. Thomas Gibson was succeeded as tenant at an unknown date, but almost certainly before 1680, by an Edward Spooner. For later we find the Dial House property being described as late Spooner's, formerly Gibson's. Edward Spooner seems to have been a particularly active and long-lived Asby resident. So why do I think he became a tenant of Dial House before 1680? Well, because of this. When we looked at this dated lintel right at the start, I said we'd come back to the identity of E.S. The match of his name with the initials, together with other evidence we'll consider in a moment, makes me very certain that Edward Spooner erected this date stone in 1680, when he built a down house which had a cross passage entrance with this dated lintel above it. When Edward Spooner died in 1721, one element of his will, dated October the 5th in that year, gives a glimpse of an occasional farmhouse activity, perhaps undertaken to earn additional income. In his will, as you can read, Edward left his loving wife Agnes, and this would have been his second wife, Agnes Dobinson, whom he'd married in 1701, 3 years after the death of Margaret, his first wife. He left Agnes a good and sufficient bed of clothes. If we had, and sadly we haven't, an inventory accompanying Edward's will, we would probably have found this good and sufficient bed in the parlour. Remember, at this period, it would very likely have been a sleeping place. The will continues. And also a new bedstead to be brought and set up at the charge of my executor, as also a great Bible, a desk, and line wheel. It is the line wheel, or linen wheel, perhaps used for spinning flax, which reminds us that at this period, as one historian points out, few people had enough land to make a living from it. Many combined farming with a secondary occupation, which in this region was often the production of woolen and linen cloth. However, I think it's possible that this wheel could also have been used for spinning the coarser hemp, because as we'll see in a couple of minutes, one of the Dial House fields was called Hemp Rig Bottoms, indicating that it was used for growing hemp, used to make sacks and rope. Agnes died only 6 months later. For the remainder of her life, she would probably have exercised her widow right under the custom of the manor court, as set out here, and confirmed by that manor court a year before Agnes's death. Is this just coincidence, or does it reflect Spooner's standing and influence and his forward thinking? That widow right, as you can read, entitled Agnes to continue living in the house at the head end, the upper end presumably, and to retain 1/2 of the whole estate of which Edward had been tenant. After Agnes's death, it looks as if half of that estate, including Dial House itself, passed into the tenancy of a John Elliotson. No manor court documents concerning property transfers survive from years immediately after the death of Agnes. But in a manor court book entry some 14 years later, in January 1735, we read that a John Elliotson has renewed his tenancy of the holding referred to as part of one Messuage and tenement, late Spooner's, at the customary rent, as you can see, of £1, 4 shillings and 7pence. That name, John Elliotson, gives us a connection to Dial House's second dated lintel. Here we have it once again, with 3 initial letters. As many of you probably know, the first is the initial letter of the husband's forename. The second, usually slightly higher than the other 2 letters, is the first letter of his, or their now shared, surname. And the third is the initial letter of the wife's forename. So I believe that the I here represents the initial letter of Johannes, as it was styled in the 18th century, for John, the E for Elliotson, and the A almost certainly for Anne, the wife of John Elliotson, whose burial is recorded using those very same words in the parish register 11 years later, on December the 27th, 1740. So it looks as if the fashionably symmetrical reconfiguration of Dial House and use of the oaks felled for roof timbers in 1728, which we encountered earlier, was the work of John and Anne Elliotson. The Elliotson family retained the tenancy of Dial House for the remainder of the 18th century and on into the early 19th. Don't worry about all the words here. The size of the holding was increased in 1774 when Thomas, son of John, took on the tenancy of moorland called intriguingly Spooner's Closes in line 7 here, suggesting that it might have been part of what had been the larger Dial House holding of Edward Spooner in the 17th century. Here we can see reference to a couple of 18th century records through which we can track Spooner's Closes being transferred, first in lines 5 and 6 from John Taylor to a John Thompson in 1761, and then, beginning at 3 lines lower down, to Thomas Elliotson himself in 1774, although you can see that Elliotson here is spelt in one of its variants as Ellison. In keeping with the nature of local landholdings within the manorial system, which meant that land was often widely scattered in a number of small parcels, the Dial House holding, as you can read beneath this image, included 2 acres of arable lands in the field called the Fitts. The Fitts were located on that broad, flat sweep of typical waterside meadow just downstream from the road bridge at Marble Mill in Great Asby, from where this photograph was taken, and which some will recognise. The Fitts, although obviously being at least part arable by the 18th century, would have begun life as part of the medieval meadowland of the 2 manors, Winderwath and Coatsford, on either side of the beck. Fit is an Old Norse word which means grassland on the bank of a river. There's also some evidence that towards the end of the 18th century and the early 19th, when the Elliotsons still held Dial House, there were periods when it was sublet. John Elliotson's grandson, also John, may have inherited the tenancy of what is now the derelict farmstead of Stannerstones, just northwest of Great Asby, towards the end of the 18th century. He appears to have been living there while subletting the Dial House holding. Bit of explanation. Rent paid by the primary tenant of the lord of the manor was fixed by the custom of the manor in this region. Again, we won't go down the rabbit hole of the reasons for this. So, they were fixed rents and not market rents. Consequently, it was possible to sublet properties at a rate many times that of the fixed copyhold rent, and there were significant profits to be had. And you can read here observations about it made by 3 regional historians. In short, as you can read, these ancient customary rents had, through the fall in the value of money, become very small. So in 1790, for example, John Elliotson, grandson of the first John E., living at Stannerstones, was taking advantage of this, and Dial House was occupied by an Anthony Nicholson, renting it from John, who, as you can conclude from the observations of Pearson and Bouch and Jones, was probably making a canny profit on the arrangement. In December 1814, the Manor Court book records that a John Thwaites of Appleby — Thwaites is a common Appleby name at this time — succeeded the first John Elliotson's grandson, also called John, as tenant. And here we can read the words of that court record. Although Dial House isn't mentioned by name, all those field names in the lower half of this paragraph, made up with only one or two of the names changed or lost, they made up the land holding of Dial House until the separate sale of the farmhouse and lands and the breaking up of the farmstead in the late 20th century. It is John Thwaites' tenancy which may have led to a new focus on dairy production and the modification of the gabled rear extension to include a dairy, which I spoke about a little while back. And here, near the beginning of line 5, we can see that field name, Hemp Rig Bottoms, the field where hemp was grown, which I mentioned when talking about the line wheel in Edward Spooner's will. The Thwaites are the first family occupying Dial House for whom we have any gravestone evidence. Here, very close to the western end of the church, there is a stone recording the burial of Nanny, wife of John Thwaites, the top arrow, John Thwaites himself, the second arrow, and two of their children, the third and fourth arrows. Robert, who predeceased both parents, dying aged 12 in 1820, a year before his mother, and another, Mary, who died unmarried in 1875. This stone is so close to the wall of the new church, although it almost certainly predates it, of course, that it must have been placed here in a new position after the rebuilding of the church. It faces the wrong way. It does not face the rising sun. The fact that the gravestone survived the upheaval of the church rebuilding of the 1860s is probably due to the fact that two Thwaites children were in the service of the lady of the manor, Anne Newell Hill, who financed the rebuilding of the church. One of the two, William, was her steward and presided over the manor court of Asby Winderwath from 1862. Indeed, just to the west of the first gravestone, and facing it, is another, marking the grave of those two brothers who were in the service of Anne Newell Hill, William and Richard Thwaites, who died within 4 weeks of each other in the spring of 1885. William's name marked by the upper arrow here, and Richard's by the lower. There is some uncertain evidence that William Thwaites acquired the freehold of Dial House in the 1840s, but he seems to have continued living near his employer, then John Hill, Anne Newell's predecessor and benefactor, sharing accommodation with his brother Richard at Castle Bank in Appleby. William Thwaites probably came to live in Dial House around 1877, but during the 1860s, to judge from the census evidence, his unmarried sister Mary appears to have been living alone there. Here at the top is part of a page from the 1861 census showing her as the only occupant of the house. By the 1871 census, the page extract below, she'd been joined by another brother, Thomas, and they're employing 2 live-in servants. We can be fairly sure it's the same property because Joseph Wilkinson, the name below in each of the entries, is living next door with his wife, Isabella. During the 1860s, there emerged some possible links between the church rebuilding and Dial House. With the farmstead occupied only by Mary Thwaites, it would have provided very convenient storage space, remember it's just across the road from the church, for a number of the movables of the church during the period of demolition and rebuilding. We've already touched on the probability that timber from the box pews from the demolished church had a second life in Dial House. It's also said that the bells of the old church were stored in Dial House before one was given to the chapel at Ormside by a later early 20th century occupant of the house, a John Brunskill. An old anecdote, which may still cause amusement. Unlike the wandering bell, not all the movables seem to have been well looked after. The church plate had gone into the care of the then rector, Henry Guy, who died in 1875. Hugh Prince, a much later rector, writing in the 1940s in his handwritten Asby memoranda, and you can read his words here, tells us that another of Guy's successors as rector was passing Croft House in Great Asby in the 1880s. By this date, Henry Guy's son and that son's niece, an illegitimate granddaughter of Henry Guy, were living at Croft House. The new rector spotted hens feeding out of what was clearly part of the 17th century church plate that had been given into Henry Guy's care. Happily, as you can read in the final line here, the new rector was able to retrieve the church plate and return it back for use in the church. We could go on to trace the final resting places in the churchyard of other 20th century occupants of Dial House, but instead, let's just note that by 1980 the whole of the farmstead was sold to a developer, and in common with many other former farmsteads in this region, the Dial House farmstead is now a number of separate dwellings. Dial House itself, Hunting House, which we've already spoken of, Dial Barn, a conversion at the rear, and my own Ray Cottage, a 1980s build, which occupies part of the footprint of the former cowhouse. We can see from some land tax returns of the 18th and 19th centuries that Dial House was a significant holding. And here we find names of people we've already met. In 1765, for example, Thomas Elliotson, the 1729 occupant's son, was the 9th highest taxpayer out of 43 assessments in Asby Winderworth. In 1791, John Elliotson, Thomas's heir and named after his grandfather, had the 6th highest tax assessment out of a total of 47. Remember, his holding had increased by 18 acres in 1774 when he took on Spooner's closes of that acreage. In 1823-4, the John Thwaites, who had taken the holding in 1814, had the 5th highest assessment out of 62, and that was also the position a few years later. As one would expect the tenants of a significant holding, we regularly find occupants of Dial House playing a part in the administrative life of the manor, as, for example, members of the jury of the manor court, and in the life of the parish as churchwardens. These yeoman figures participated in local life and administration in a manner similar to those off-comers and blow-ins who now occupy their homes. First, we have our old friend Edward Spooner, he of the 1680 date stone, listed as one of the manor court jurors in the late 17th century. A fairly uniform hand here, and no illiterate jurors described as making their mark, so this list was probably written by a literate person administering the manor court. And here is our second date stone man, John Elliotson, another juror of the Manor Court, and listed as such in 1731. Here we have the signatures of those two Thwaites brothers, William and Richard, taking part, along with a great many others, in a riding of the boundaries of the manor of Asby Windewath in 1834. At this date, they would be taking part in the riding not as tenants, but because, if you remember, they were both in the service of the lord of the manor of Asby Windewath at that time, John Hill. And only 1 year later, in 1835, their father, John, tenant of Dial House since 1814, but perhaps not living there until a little while later, is a signatory, as juror, to a decision of the Manor Court. Now, off-comers and blow-ins may wish to examine the story of their homes in a way similar to that which has enabled me to partially capture the story of Dial House. You could begin by trying to interpret surviving older features in the fabric of your house. There are a number of print sources on regional vernacular architecture to help you, especially the work of the late Ron Brunskill and of Susan Denyer. And for a handy guide on house fixtures and fittings, although it's not confined to this area, there's the work of Linda Hall. But for a local source of tuition and training in how to interpret buildings, you could join the Cumbria Vernacular Buildings Group, only £10 a year for single membership and £15 for a couple. It's now being chaired by the expert historic buildings consultant, Paul Lewis from Penrith. Although there has been a tenfold increase in its membership since it was founded in 2014, new members are still very welcome. You can download a membership form from the group's website. I won't attempt a full list of archive sources, both locally and at the National Archives at Kew. You will all have seen the sort of thing, or some of you will have seen the sort of thing, that is possible by using archive records in the brilliant snapshot of Great Asby in 1910-11, produced by Graham Parkin and Valerie Mandelson, blending, as they did, data from the 1910 and 1911 census and the 1910 land valuation survey to reconstruct the village 100 years ago. It's on display in a bus shelter mural, and it's also set out in a booklet which can be purchased at the bar of the Three Greyhounds Inn. For a guide to archive material of all kinds, you could do worse than starting with Tracing the History of Your House by Nick Barrett. It does what it says in its subtitle on the cover. It guides you to sources which can be used to tell the story of your home. Another, slightly more recent book I'll confess I'm not familiar with, this one by Jill Blanchard. She's still a very active researcher and offers an online course called, unsurprisingly, Tracing a House History. It's offered through her company, Past Search. I hope you haven't found all this too tedious, and I also hope that by sharing a little of the story of Dial House and a little of the story of some of its occupants, I've been able to give you a flavour of the story that it's possible to tell about the past life of a dwelling and about the human lives lived in that dwelling. As ever, thank you very, very much indeed for listening.